Florida is a sunny state with humid air and endless suburban streets. Neighbors have known each other for years, but they always leave the doors closed that they don't want to open for prying eyes. On this street, everyone knows everyone else, but only from the outside. The quiet and monotonous life seems stable until someone upsets the established order. Clara Benton was a housewife. Her day consisted of the same rituals: making breakfast for her husband, cleaning the house, shopping at the supermarket, and watching TV shows in the evening while Henry silently scrolled through the news on his phone. Her marriage to Henry had long since ceased to be the warm union it had been in the beginning. They lived together, but as if in parallel lives. Henry came home late from work, showed no interest in what was happening with Clara, and gradually became a stranger to her. That morning, Clara was making coffee and looking out the window at the neighboring house. At the gate stood young Adam Wilson, the son of their neighbors. His father had left the family long ago, and Sarah Wilson, his mother, was raising the boy alone. Now Adam was home for the summer from college, and for the first time Clara noticed how much he had changed. The boy she remembered had grown into a tall young man with a confident look and an easy smile. His muscles stood out clearly under his t-shirt, and his face was full of youthful carefreeness. Clara caught herself looking at him longer than necessary. It was only a moment, but she could already feel something new emerging inside her. An excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. She thought her heart was beating faster, although it was probably just her imagination. Well, it's worth a look, she thought, justifying herself. That afternoon, Clara went for a walk near the house, just as Adam was washing his car in the driveway. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Benton," he said with a friendly smile. "And hello, Adam. Summers in Florida are tough, aren't they?" Clara replied, trying to look calm. They exchanged a few words, and this conversation was the first thread in the web that began to weave between them. Clara felt something new and dangerous. She enjoyed talking to him, even though she knew it was wrong. As the days passed, their conversations became longer and deeper. Adam shared his plans for the future, talked about his studies and difficulties, and Clara felt needed and interesting again. She noticed that she was waiting for the moments when she could see him. One day they were having tea together in the backyard when Adam took her hand and everything changed. It happened quickly and suddenly, but Clara didn't push him away. She let it happen. Their connection was born out of a forbidden desire, but it seemed unstoppable. Soon their relationship went beyond casual conversations. They met when Henry was at work, enjoying those moments that seemed like a forbidden paradise. But with each meeting, Clara realized that they were playing a dangerous game. Once, after another meeting, Adam accidentally left his lighter in Clara's kitchen. She didn't think anything of it and just put it back on the shelf. It was a small thing that seemed insignificant, but later this lighter would become the key to a mystery that would change everything. Henry noticed that Clara had changed. She became more alive, as if something had brought her joy back to life. He couldn't figure out what it was, but he felt that an invisible wall had appeared between them. One night he tried to talk to her about it, but Clara just shrugged her shoulders. "We all change, Henry. Maybe sometimes you just have to accept those changes," she said, trying not to give herself away. Henry didn't insist. He wasn't the type of man to get into a fight. He preferred to stay out of it, even if it meant losing touch with his wife. Sarah Wilson, meanwhile, noticed changes in her son's behavior. Adam would often leave the house without explanation and return late. At first, she thought it was typical teenage pranks, but then she began to suspect that something was wrong with him. One day, she decided it was typical teenage pranks, but then she began to suspect that something was wrong with him. One day, she decided to talk to him directly. "You spend a lot of time away from home, Adam. Who are you seeing?" she asked gently, but insistently. "They're just friends, Mom. Don't worry," he answered evasively, trying to avoid further questioning. Sarah felt that her son was hiding something, but she didn't want to pressure him. She trusted him and could not imagine that he could be involved in anything serious. This is how this dangerous game developed. Clara and Adam felt invisible to everyone, even though the world around them was slowly beginning to piece together their secrets. The first chapter ends with Clara sitting in the kitchen, looking at the lighter Adam left behind. She thinks she has everything under control, but she doesn't know that this small thing will be fatal when the truth comes out and the life she tried to build begins to fall apart like a house of cards. The following weeks were like a dream for Clara. She felt younger, alive, and able to feel passion again. Her connection with Adam gave her the emotions she hadn't experienced in her marriage to Henry for a long time. They met secretly in her home when her husband was at work or on deserted beaches outside the city. Each time, Clara promised herself that it would be the last time. But when Adam touched her, all promises lost their meaning. Adam couldn't resist the game either. For him, his relationship with Clara was more than just an adventure. He fell in love with her, and this forbidden love only intensified his feelings. In his eyes, Clara was the woman who understood him better than anyone else. He didn't think about the consequences. It seemed to him that they could always keep their relationship a secret. However, as often happens with secrets, it became increasingly difficult to hide them. Once during a regular meeting, Adam stayed overnight at Clara's house. They drank wine on the terrace, listening to the wind rustling between the palm trees. It seemed to her that the world had stopped, no worries, just him and her. But in the morning, as they were eating breakfast together in the kitchen, Clara heard the front door open. Henry was home earlier than usual. He walked into the house to find 2 glasses of wine on the table and a man's jacket, not his own. His voice sounded dry, but there was a dangerous tension in it. Adam quickly left the room, trying not to make eye contact with Henry. It was only a second, but it changed everything. Henry didn't know who the man was, but his instinct was that something was wrong. He silently turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door. Clara realized that their relationship was now in jeopardy. Henry wasn't a fool. He would definitely start asking questions and looking for answers, and even though he didn't know who was in the house yet, she could feel a storm coming. Meanwhile, Sarah Wilson also began to suspect that her son was hiding something. She couldn't understand where he was disappearing to so often and why his behavior had become so strange. One day she tried to talk to him seriously. "You act like you're hiding something from me, Adam. What's going on?" Her voice was gentle but insistent. "Nothing, Mom. Just a lot on my mind," he answered evasively, not wanting to reveal the truth. Sarah felt that she would not get the truth from her son, but decided to keep it in mind. Her intuition told her to be on the alert. Clara began to feel nervous. Henry was silent and aloof, which only increased her anxiety. One evening he asked her, "Is there something you want to tell me, Clara?" "What do you mean?" she replied, trying not to show her anxiety. "But don't worry, I'll soon find out what it is," he said quietly and turned back to his phone. Clara realized that they didn't have much time. She was afraid that Henry might find out about her affair, but she was even more afraid that it would expose them to everyone. After that night with Adam, things became more confusing. Their meetings continued, but every time they were together, Clara felt not only passion but also fear. One day, when Adam accidentally left his lighter in the kitchen again, she almost snapped at him. "Be careful. If Henry finds this, he'll understand," she whispered nervously. Adam just smiled and took her hand. "I'm not afraid of him, Clara. We'll get through this." Her heart sank at these words. She knew that nothing could be predicted in this dangerous game. Each new day became more and more difficult. Clara could no longer relax. She was haunted by the fear of being exposed, as well as an inexplicable premonition that something bad was about to happen. One day she sat in the kitchen and looked at the same lighter that Adam had left with her again. It was a small thing that now had the weight of a mountain. Clara knew that this story could not end well, but she had already come too far to turn back. Henry stayed home more and more, suspecting that his wife was hiding something. He tried to gather evidence and understand what exactly was going on. His silence scared Clara more than any screaming. She knew something was brewing, but she couldn't predict how far things would go. The day began as usual without any major changes, but Clara felt that this calmness was deceptive. She lived with an inner fear and a premonition that her secret affair with Adam was about to explode. It seemed to her that there was no more time, everything was coming apart at the seams. Their last meeting was decisive. They were sitting together in Clara's living room discussing the future. "We can't go on like this," Adam said. You need to say something to Henry. I can't, Clara whispered, lowering her head. It would destroy him. Adam took her hand, trying to convince her that they could make it through this, but they didn't know they were already exposed. The door opened so suddenly that Clara jumped. Sarah Wilson stood in the doorway. Her eyes expressed rage and despair at the same time. She already knew the truth, and it burned her soul. How could you, Clara? Sarah hissed through her teeth. How could you do this to my son? Clara opened her mouth to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Adam also froze, not knowing how to justify himself to his mother. Sarah walked over to him, grabbed his arm, and pulled him toward the door. Let's go home. Right now, she said firmly, not looking at Clara. And don't you ever dare look at her again. Adam took one last look at Clara, but his mother was already pulling him along. They left the house, leaving her alone in the silence and fear. The day passed in tension between everyone. After Sarah Wilson found Clara and Adam together, she silently dragged her son home. At the doorway, she paused only for a moment. Looking at Clara with a look that seemed to pierce her soul, words were unnecessary. Sarah would never return, but her presence had already left a deep mark. Adam followed his mother, dejected and confused, like a teenager caught in the act of doing something shameful. He took one last look at Clara, as if to say goodbye, but said nothing. The door closed, leaving Clara alone in the house that now seemed like a trap. That night, Clara tried to calm down, but to no avail. Her thoughts were swirling around what had happened. Sarah had figured it out. And Adam wouldn't be able to come anymore. Her refuge from reality had suddenly fallen apart. And the worst part was that now she was left with Henry, the man she had run away from in this forbidden affair. It seemed to her that everything around her was conspiring against her. Clara nervously walked from room to room trying to find something to do, but every step seemed difficult, as if her legs would not obey her. She could only wait for Henry to return from work and treat her as he always did. Silently, indifferently, aloofly. Suddenly the phone rang. Clara picked up the phone and heard her husband's voice. His tone was calm but unusually even. Hello, Clara. I've decided to go fishing. I won't be home until tomorrow, he paused and then added. Don't wait for me. Get some rest. Clara was silent for a few seconds, trying to figure out what he really meant. Okay, she replied, trying to hide the relief in her voice. See you tomorrow, he said briefly and hung up. She put the phone away inside, thinking that at least tonight she would be able to be alone and sort out her thoughts, but the feeling of anxiety still persisted. There was something about that phone call, something that kept her on her toes. Clara spent the rest of the evening wandering around the empty house. She was haunted by thoughts of what would happen next, and she couldn't bring herself to sleep. It seemed to her that the house was too quiet, as if it was waiting for something too. Night covered the city in darkness, and Clara was alone in her bedroom. She laid down on the bed, tired but restless. Her eyes closed, but her sleep was intermittent and restless, as if she was waiting for something to happen. And it did. Clara was awakened by a barely audible creak. She thought it was a dream, but cold fear gripped her as she saw a silhouette in her bedroom doorway. It happened quickly without warning. Time stood still as the stranger approached her. She felt something cold and sharp on her neck. Before she could scream, a blow fell on her throat. The world began to disappear. Her body went cold and blood spilled all over the bedding. The last thing she felt was pain and horror, which were forever frozen in her mind. Darkness covered her forever. Clara Benton was found dead the next morning. Her body was lying on the bed, and a knife stained with blood was lying on the floor nearby. There were no signs of a struggle or any signs of a robbery. It all looked too personal. The morning after Clara Benton's murder, the atmosphere in the Florida suburb was tense and disturbing. The streets were filled with rumors and speculation, and gossip about Clara's death spread faster than the morning news. Everyone wondered what could have happened in this seemingly quiet and peaceful home. Detective George Morgan, an experienced and detail-oriented professional, arrived at the scene. He was well aware that a crime that seemed simple at first glance often hides much more, and this case already seemed suspicious to him. Morgan began to examine the bedroom where Clara's body was found. He carefully recorded every detail: the broken mirror, the traces of blood on the bedding, the knife lying next to the body. The strange calm in the room suggested that the killer may have known his victim and that the murder was personal. "This doesn't look like a random crime," Morgan said, turning to his partner, Officer Cole. "Do you think it's a family member?" asked Cole, surveying the scene. "We can't rule it out," replied Morgan thoughtfully. While examining the scene, he found a lighter on a shelf. It was in the wrong place. Too strange for an insignificant item. He picked it up and examined it carefully. "This could be the key," he said quietly to himself. Morgan knew well that it was these seemingly unimportant things that could open the way to the truth. Henry Benton, Clara's husband, showed up later that morning. He looked calm, almost too calm, and his demeanor up later that morning. He looked calm, almost too calm, and his demeanor caught Morgan's attention. He seemed to be a man who had either learned to hide his emotions or was consciously keeping himself under control. "Were you out last night?" Morgan asked, taking Henry aside for a chat. "Yes, I went fishing. I wanted to get some rest," Henry answered calmly. "Can anyone confirm that?" Morgan asked. Henry shrugged his shoulders slightly. "I was alone. But I left a message for my wife. She knew I wouldn't be home." This answer seemed a little too convenient for Morgan, but he didn't show his suspicions. In his practice, there were people who seemed innocent, but something gave them away. He was used to keeping such things in mind and waiting for new evidence to emerge. Sarah Wilson also ran to the scene when she heard the news of Clara's death. Her son Adam followed her, looking confused and depressed. "What happened? How did she die?" Sarah asked breathlessly, hugging Adam as if to protect him from an invisible threat. "We're still finding out," Morgan answered. "Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to ask you some questions later." Sarah nodded, but her eyes were full of fear. She had a feeling that Clara's death was no accident, and she knew that their connection to the woman might come out. Adam stood silently. His gaze was blank, and his face was full of guilt. He couldn't take his eyes off the house where the tragedy had just occurred. Morgan immediately noticed Adam's behavior. Something in his posture betrayed an emotional connection to the victim, even though he was trying hard to hide it. "Adam, can I talk to you?" the detective asked. "Did you know Clara well?" She was a neighbor. He answered quietly. "Just talk." Morgan saw Adam rubbing his fingers nervously, as if trying to escape his own thoughts. It was a small detail, but it could be important. After talking to Adam and Sarah, Morgan decided to observe their behavior. It was important to give them time to let their nerves give out. He was in no hurry to draw conclusions, but he could already sense that this case was going to be difficult. The lighter found at the crime scene and the behavior of the victim's husband gave him reason to think that there was still a lot to the story. Why was Clara killed that night when Henry was away, according to him, who left the lighter next to the body, and did Adam know more than he wanted to admit? The investigation was just beginning. Morgan was well aware that the truth is always a complex puzzle, and so far he had only a few pieces. But he was already sure of two things. This crime was no accident, and each of these people was hiding something. The lighter seemed to be waiting for its time to tell its story, and Morgan was ready to collect every little detail that would help him find the killer. Detective George Morgan carefully analyzed all the clues and evidence he found. Something about the case seemed wrong to him from the very beginning. Henry Benton was too calm for a man whose wife had been brutally murdered. Adam Wilson acted nervous, and his mother Sarah seemed to be hiding something. But there was no direct evidence to point to the culprit. The lighter remained an important detail that haunted Morgan. It was found next to the body. But why was it there during the interviews? Adam mentioned that he had left the lighter at Clara's house earlier, but claimed that he had not seen it after that. This confirmed that he had been in the victim's house, but did it mean he was involved in the crime? Something told Morgan that the lighter could have been in the room on purpose, as if someone wanted to frame Adam or deflect suspicion away from themselves. This theory began to take shape in his mind. The next day, Morgan decided to focus on Henry Benton. He invited him to the police station for a conversation. Henry's appearance hadn't changed, still calm and poised with no sign of grief or anxiety. "Tell me again about your evening of fishing," Morgan asked, sitting comfortably in his chair. "I was alone as usual. I went out in the evening and told Clara in advance that I wouldn't be home," Henry replied. "Did you know that your wife and Adam Wilson were having a relationship?" Morgan suddenly asked, looking at Henry intently. "I suspected something," he admitted, "but I decided not to interfere." It was her choice. Morgan found this answer too convenient. Henry was saying that he knew about the affair but ignored it. There was something in his voice that did not fit the logic of a man who had just lost his wife. Morgan also invited Sarah and Adam for additional questioning. He knew that the young man was dealing with Clara's death, but his behavior was becoming even more suspicious. "Adam, have you seen Clara much lately?" Morgan asked, watching his reaction. Adam sighed and ran his hand over his face. He looked exhausted. "Yes, we met." "But I didn't kill her, if that's what you mean," he replied, trying to avoid the detective's direct gaze. "How did your lighter end up near her body?" Morgan continued, holding the same piece of evidence in his hands. Adam looked at the lighter and shrugged nervously. "I've left it at her house before, but I don't know how it ended up there that night. It wasn't me." His voice sounded broken, and Morgan could see the truth in it. But even if Adam hadn't killed Clara, someone had deliberately framed him. Morgan carefully reviewed the neighborhood surveillance footage. It was his last chance to find something concrete. One of the neighbors' cameras captured the lights in the Benton's garage at the exact time Henry said he was supposed to be fishing. This detail raised new questions. The detective also looked at the details of the calls from Clara's phone. The last person to call her that night was Henry. He told her that he was going fishing and would return only the next day. But why were the lights in the house still on when they shouldn't have been? Morgan began to piece together the picture. Henry could have known about his wife's affair and deliberately planned her murder, making it look like a random robbery or crime of passion. But the evidence was still lacking. Morgan gathered evidence that hinted that the killer was closer to Clara than it seemed at first glance. With each new clue, the suspicion centered more and more on Henry. He was the only one who could know everything and who had the motive to end his wife's life after learning about her affair with a young neighbor. However, to break him and find out the truth, Morgan would have to be careful. This murder was coldly planned, and every little thing left at the crime scene could be part of the game. The day came when Detective George Morgan gathered all the necessary details for the final interrogation. He knew it was time to force the culprit to reveal the truth. The puzzle had been coming together gradually, and now Morgan just had to take the last step to get to the bottom of the truth. The main suspect, Henry Benton, came to the station as calm as ever. He behaved impeccably. His answers were measured, and his emotions were under control. But Morgan knew there was something more to it, and it was the small details that would help him prove his case. Morgan invited Henry into his office and began the interrogation calmly. As if it were a routine conversation, he asked again about the fishing trip that night. "I wasn't home," Henry repeated with cold confidence. "I've already told you everything." Morgan nodded to indicate that he was listening intently. Then he suddenly pulled out a lighter on the table. "We found this near Clara's body. I wonder how the lighter could have gotten there if it was in your house before." Henry flinched slightly, but quickly pulled himself together. "Someone else must have left it there. Maybe Adam. They used to see each other a lot," he said calmly. Morgan leaned forward, looking Henry intently in the eye. "We've been through the neighborhood security footage," he said quietly. "The lights in your garage were on at 9:30. "That's definitely not fishing, is it?" Henry fell silent, but his face remained unmoved. He knew that any extra word could expose him, but Morgan could see the pressure building. Morgan decided to make one last move. "Henry, I understand that you knew about your wife's infidelity. You knew she was seeing Adam. You even called her that night to tell her you were going fishing. But you didn't go, did you?" "You stayed home." Henry remained silent. But this time his eyes revealed an inner struggle. "You knew she was cheating on you, and you decided to end it once and for all," Morgan continued. You came home that night and killed Clara, and you left a lighter by the body to throw suspicion on Adam. It all seemed almost perfect. Almost Henry clenched his hands into fists, his face suddenly grim. Yes, I knew, Henry said quietly, seeming to ponder each word. I knew about their relationship a long time ago. I saw everything, but I didn't say anything. I thought I could survive it. I thought she would stop on her own. He paused, as if remembering that fateful evening. But when she said she didn't need me anymore, I snapped. I couldn't hold myself back any longer. His voice was quiet and cold, without any sign of remorse. It wasn't jealousy, it was a choice. I did what I had to do. She betrayed me, I just couldn't let her go on with that guy. Henry finished, lowering his head. Morgan listened carefully to his confession. He knew he had the truth, the lighter near the body, the light in the garage, and the call Henry had made to create an alibi all added up to a coherent picture. Henry Benton didn't destroy his wife because of infidelity alone. He did it because he couldn't accept the fact that she had chosen a different life without him. And now his own fate was sealed. Morgan calmly got up from the table and looked at Henry. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say will be used against you in a court of law, he said. Henry did not resist being handcuffed. He just said quietly, I don't care anymore. Later that day, Detective George Morgan walked out of the station and breathed in the fresh air. He knew that justice had been served, but he also realized that there were no winners in this story. Many people's lives had been ruined, and all because of secrets that had long remained hidden behind closed doors. The trial of Henry Benton became a major topic in the Florida suburbs. The shock of Clara's murder and the revelation of her relationship with Adam Wilson gripped all the neighbors. Those who had considered the Bentons to be a model family just yesterday were now discussing how years of secrets had turned into tragedy. The trial was supposed to put an end to this story, but it left many open wounds. In the courtroom, Henry Benton sat as he had during the interrogations, cold and distant, as if he had already accepted his fate. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree premeditated murder, emphasizing that the crime was motivated by anger and premeditated. The main piece of evidence was a lighter found at the crime scene. Thanks to it, Detective Morgan discovered that Henry had not been fishing, as he claimed. The testimony of Sarah and Adam confirmed that Clara was having an affair, and the call from Henry that night turned out to be a cunning alibi that he himself destroyed by returning home and committing the murder. Henry's lawyers tried to justify him, explaining his actions as an emotional breakdown due to his wife's infidelity. But the evidence was too strong. The planning of the murder, his calm behavior after the crime, and his attempts to frame Adam made the defense's case weak. After several weeks of hearings, the jury found Henry Benton guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence was harsh, but deserved. Henry, who had previously lived under the mask of a calm and respectful man, became an example of how internalized anger can lead to disaster. When the verdict was announced, the room was filled with a buzz. Some believed that Henry had received a well-deserved punishment, while others sympathized with him, seeing him as a man destroyed by betrayal and his own feelings. Sarah Wilson and her son Adam were present in court when the verdict was announced. Sarah held her son's hand tightly, trying to protect him from the burden of guilt. Adam looked broken. He realized that his affair with Clara had been the catalyst for the tragedy. It's all my fault, he whispered after the verdict. Sarah tried to comfort him, but realized that this experience would forever be a part of their lives. The neighbors discussed the trial for a long time. Those who had once considered Clara guilty of treason now grieved for her, realizing that she had paid the ultimate price for her mistakes. However, even those who sympathized with Clara could not justify her actions that led to the tragedy. After the trial was over, Detective George Morgan sat in his office and reviewed the case files. He knew he had done the right thing, but he was still bitter. There were no winners in this case. One man was dead, another was in prison for life, and Adam and Sarah were now forced to live with the consequences of their decisions. Morgan once again recalled how an ordinary lighter became the key to solving the crime, A small detail that no one had paid attention to at first changed the entire course of the investigation. There are no small things in these cases, he told himself as he closed the case file. He knew that the truth sometimes comes through the smallest of traces, and that the truth sometimes comes through the smallest of traces, and that the worst crimes often occur where they are least expected. Henry Benton began his new life behind bars without ever expressing remorse. He believed he had done what he had to do and accepted his sentence with the same cold indifference with which he had committed the crime. Adam and Sarah left the city, trying to start a new life away from the memories of what happened. But they will have to carry this burden for the rest of their lives, knowing that their decisions have affected the lives of others. For Morgan, this case was another reminder of the complexity of human nature and how small secrets can lead to big tragedies. He knew that there was no room for illusions in his work. Only facts, only the truth, no matter how bitter it was. That's how this story ended. Without heroes, no happy ending. Only the truth, cold and inexorable like life.